due diligence to me starts way before you actually get a property under contract. And so I wanted to start there. You know, you drive or shop the location. Preferably, you can drive it. I know some folks don't live anywhere near the properties that they're making offers on, so that might be a little difficult. But you can also shop the location by Google. I mean, Google the property, Google crime, and the property name, and there's a lot of information that you can find about it. I like to drive to the location. I like to see the other properties that are in the area. I like to see what they look like versus a property I'm buying. And I like to find a convenience store in that nearest to the property. And I like to see who's walking in that convenience store because that's going to be your renter profile more than likely. Most people live, 5 to 10 miles from, where they work if they can. Others do commute, but typically if you go to a convenience store near there, you're going to see who's in the area and it'll give you a good idea. Um, when you're driving the property, I like to look for things that stand out to me. Do the roofs look bad? Does the landscaping look bad? Are the trees, hanging over the roofs? Um, there are lots of clues as to how the current seller or the current owner has maintained that property, and just by driving it, you can get a good idea. Um, you can also tour with the broker, which I highly recommend. And I recommend that you look at the offering memorandum that they send out and the rent roll and the T12 or the financial statements. Make a list of questions so that as you're walking around the property with that broker, you can ask them those questions. It's a lot harder for somebody to evade a question if you're looking straight at them. And so asking those questions of the broker is really good. You also will probably have a member of the on-site team that manages that property walking with you. And it's a great opportunity to ask them some of the questions, such as where do most of your residents work? Right, because that's going to give you an indication of the types of jobs primarily that people hold in that area, which gives you a clue about how much money they might make, right? The incomes, etc. So those are really good questions to ask while you're at the property. They don't always answer you, but you might ask, what are some things that you spend money on a monthly basis? What are some of your bigger expenses? I wouldn't ask what's broken, but if you ask what are some of your biggest expense categories, sometimes they'll tell you things, sometimes they won't. But doesn't hurt to ask. You'll get an answer. You'll just be able to determine by the answer whether you feel like there's more to follow up or not. By looking at the T12, you can ask things like, uh, you know, if there's laundry income, are the machines owned by the seller? Are they rented from a company like CoinMock that's their business is to rent out machines to a property. So there are lots of things you can pick up from that, from looking at the T12 and the rent roll. If you sort the rent roll, you can find out if leases are trading up or renting for more of late than maybe they were 6 months ago. So there are lots of trends and information you can find off of that. You can pick up on things like, their water bill seems to have spiked. Did they have a leak that they repaired? There's a lots of clues in the financial statements that can help trigger questions while you're touring with that broker. And they will be impressed that you took the time to do that homework. A crime review. We don't even underwrite a property until we've looked at the crime data on the property. And that's because if there is crime, you're not going to get the best renter because no one wants to live in an area with crime. Now, there's a difference between petty crime, like, cars being broken into versus homicide. If there has been a pretty what I call aggressive crimes, the lender might also have an issue with the property. So if you get ahead of it and Google it and pull the crime data, you'll be able to determine um, whether you think you'd be comfortable with that. In our case, since our people, our employees run the properties, we do a pretty in-depth crime look because if I wouldn't send my own kids there, I don't want to send an employee there. So big one before you even spend time looking at numbers. Um, the demographics, this is important. You can pull data, I know ALN, Smart Data, CoStar, if you have access to that, will produce demographic reports, or you can even pull them sometimes from broker data. They may have it in the offering memorandum. So you're looking for, is there growth in that area, in a 1 to 5 mile area? Are households growing? Is the population growing? Are jobs available in that area? Um, One of the key things is income. We do a big study on whether the people that are in that area can afford the rents that we are putting in our pro forma budget. So that is a huge one. I'm big on data diving, and demographics is very, very big for me. In terms of market saturation, what I mean is, as you're looking at that property, is that one property surrounded by 15, 20 others, right? And are those properties big properties, small properties? Because you want to understand how much competition there is in that area, because ultimately people may want to live in that area, but you're competing against every other property. So you should understand, how will my property look and compete against these other properties that are in the area. Future deliveries, the brokers, the big brokers in each market have all of this information, and it just means how many housing or building permits or construction permits have been issued and are projected to be delivered in that area. Because if an area, one, if somebody's building there, it's probably a good hint that it's a good area. But two, if you flood an area with too many units, then there's going to be concessions, right? Where people are giving offers to people to move into their property versus the next property. And so that's important to look at. And you can also get clues on concessions by looking at the financial statements. If an owner does not break out concessions and bad debt, and vacancy, then those are good questions to ask, because otherwise you have one big lump number and you don't know what's driving some of those losses to that property. So, and then again, future deliveries gives you a clue whether there be more competition in that market. And if the households aren't growing in that market, then you end up seeing some concessions. Okay, and when we're looking at a property, it's important to know your market, and most importantly, the sub-market. So we buy in San Antonio and Houston to date, um, and that was on purpose. We started in San Antonio and really wanted to build a strong foundation before we went to a second market. We chose Houston because it behaves a lot like San Antonio. It's just bigger. It's 4 to 5 times bigger. But the demographic data told us that there's a lot of renters. So San Antonio, 51% of the households rent. In Houston, it's 58%. And so understanding that data is important. One of the things, as I mentioned, is new construction absorption rates. This tells you by the submarket, you can see the chart to the right, what the absorption is, right? How many units were delivered, and gives you an idea of how many were absorbed, meaning how many more people were there to rent those units, right? So we've got Northwest Houston outlined there because that is a submarket we bought 4 properties in. So we wanted to make sure we understood, and it's ranks #1 in terms of vacancy and absorption. So we wanted to understand, how did it do versus the rest of the submarkets, because Houston is a huge, huge market. The other thing we're looking at when we're kind of doing our our due diligence before we even submit a contract is occupancy trends. Vacancy and rent are huge. So this data is available out there. Brokers have it. You can Google it. You'll find a lot of that on the internet. But it shows you what's happened in terms of vacancy, and vacancy is a big number. So you can see where it's projected to be in the future years. So a 9.3 vacancy is not bad. I mean, that means that you've got lots of folks still wanting to rent in that market. However, what we also do is we match this up with what we're seeing in from our properties. Our properties do a market survey every week. They send it into the asset manager team, and we're studying what's happening in and around. They're calling their competitors. Our properties are calling their competitors to get the same data, and we compare it to this. So, for example, it's showing 2022 um, in this particular pocket having a 9.6% vacancy. Our portfolio in Houston is occupied 97%. So this would tell me that this data isn't necessarily accurate because it's for the whole market, not necessarily for the submarkets that we're in. So understanding occupancy is important because you are going to underwrite a certain occupancy projection in your pro forma budget. So understanding this data is going to help you underwrite a little closer to what's happening in the market. In addition, we're looking at rent growth. You know, what is forecasted for rent growth in these markets? And I can't move it either. Sorry. Let me go back. So you can see where the forecast is and where it is. The yellow is Houston overall. Green is effective rent. Effective rent is when you take out concessions, loss to lease, etc. You end up with the effective rent. So you want to see what that's a good number to always understand about the property you're looking at. And then market rent per unit, etc. So you can see where the trend has been and where it's projected. So it's great. I mean, it's showing really good numbers, so it makes you feel really comfortable. The other thing is we put together a webinar before when we put this in front of our investors, and all of this data is in there. So if you're gathering out on the front end, you can put a really nice package together for your investors when you're ready to share that with them. Okay, so we talked about pre-LOI, a lot of the stuff that we do. Let's talk about pre-contract. So you've submitted an LOI, you've been awarded the property basically by the broker, and now you're getting ready, you're negotiating the contract. So what are some of the key things to do in your due diligence process? Number one is you need to vet your insurance. There's three huge cost on a property expenses. You have insurance, you have taxes, and you have payroll. So insurance is a big one. We work with an insurance broker locally, and so we don't get this data necessarily until we know we've been awarded an LOI, because you'll exhaust them and they'll get kind of tired of every time you're looking at a property, you're sending them, having them do work to really estimate the insurance. But once you have it awarded to you, then have an insurance broker that can give you what insurance would run on this particular property. You won't have an exact number until you have the seller give you loss runs, which means any losses on the property. So you want to make sure you include that in the list of items that you want the seller to provide you, is loss runs for insurance. Debt. We have our lender, our primary lender, pre-underwrite um, the properties at this stage and tell us what does the leverage look like? Is it qualifying for, 70, 75% loan to value or loan to cost? How do the lenders look at a particular submarket, a particular city? All of that data they can provide you at this stage, so that while you're looking at this, you know exactly what your debt might be looking like and what you're going to have to raise in terms of equity. So let's look at the of an item on here, which is taxes. We work with an insurance consultant, Ryan, and so we have him also give us an idea of what have taxes done over the last 3 to 5 years on this particular property. Where does he estimate taxes will end up? In some cases, you get lucky because by this time of year, we know what the tax valuations are for the properties because they've been issued by the taxing authorities. So we know that. And we can make sure that we've underwritten adequately. We don't underwrite 100% of the taxes unless the seller has not protested in past years and there might be an issue with maybe fighting the taxes at this stage. Um, we also identify a company that's going to do your due diligence. As I said earlier, we do our own, but it's important to identify a company, and hopefully it's somebody you've been talking to that's helped you review your pro forma budget, and you've already talked to them about managing this particular property. So it's important to identify that. Some of them will charge you $5,000 to $8,000, but they will credit it back to you once you sign a contract with them to manage the property. Okay, and now we're going to talk about once you're under contract, what are some of the due diligence items that you need to be planning for? So, unit walks. We walk 100% of the units at every property. Now, COVID gave us some interesting challenges because there were times when the broker would tell us, well, there's somebody in this unit that has COVID or, doesn't want to be exposed to COVID. And so we always found a workaround for those. But if you can see 100% of the units, you want to, because you don't want to later discover that there are some units that are down. In other words, they need, 30 to, $40,000 to bring them back up so that you can make revenue off of them. You want to know if there are any of those, and it's okay to ask the broker, are there any down units at this property? And ask them to let you know what's the status of them. Do they have sheetrock? Do they have appliances? Do they have cabinets? Or are they down to basically the studs? So that's important to know and understand because it plays into your rehab budget. You want to take this data and build it into your rehab budget before you finalize it with the lender. Okay, so let's look at lease audits. We receive the leases either digitally because the company has them all online, or they may be physical leases. So what you want to ask for is to be able to see not only the lease, but you want to see everything that goes with it. Their application when they applied for the lease, their income verification, their credit or crime scoring, their criminal background. You want to see all of that. Some sellers say, well, we don't have that or it's confidential. Well, you signed an agreement when you put this under contract that you would not disclose this data, so you're covered. So that should not be excuse for them not to give you access to that data because you're going to find out a lot of things from looking at the leases. One, how much income do the people that live at that property make today? And we actually put a chart together for our investor webinar where we show the income and the employment of everybody on that property on a graph, all combined, of course. And then we show what would happen. Would these people be able to afford a $58 increase, a $100 increase, $200 increase? Or would you be re-tenanting that property because the people that are there today can't afford it? Or it may make you stop and pause and wonder whether you have projected too high of a rent or not high enough of a rent. So the lease audit information is super, super important. We spend a lot of time looking at the lease data. Um, and again, the income piece of it's important. The criminal piece of it is important. We don't take people with, terrible criminal backgrounds because If you do, they typically have friends with the same backgrounds, and so you end up with a property with a lot of crime. And so it's important to look at all of those details on the lease audit. The third party inspections, plumbing, roofs, foundation, you want to cover all the big items on that property that might cost you money if you don't discover an issue during due diligence. If you discover a big issue, then you can go back to the broker and say, hey, the roofs are shot, they need to file an insurance claim, or let's come to an agreement on that. I wouldn't go to the broker with little things like, oh, well, this one unit had, a hole in the sheetrock. That's considered small and minor. You want to really look at the big things. We have a plumbing company come and camera the sewer lines. Not all of them necessarily, but at least a representative sample to make sure there's not broken lines, to make sure that there's not tree roots in the sewer lines, because water can be super expensive. And you can also get a clue by looking at their financials. Again, did you see high water for this type of size of the property? And then it's a key to ask that question. And roofs and foundations. A lot of cities, I know Texas in particular, the Dallas-Fort Worth area, there's clay soil. So you might have settlement. So you're just going to determine, is the variance or the tolerance levels more than just a standard settlement in the soil? Is it really a foundation issue? And these three things are things that you can go back and talk to the broker and say, you know what, based on our estimate, and we have our the folks doing these inspections give us an estimate, a written estimate for repairs, so that if we do have to go back to the broker, we already have that. We're not having to call them back to the property to give us that data. And then you use all of this to update your rehab budget. You know, do you, from the unit walks, are you going to have to renovate, 25% or 50% of the units versus maybe what you thought in the beginning you were going to do to get the income up? On the exterior, are you going to have to paint? Are you going to have to fix wood rot? Are you going to have to fix sidewalks? I mean, the lenders are big on trip hazards, right? So if you have a sidewalk that's kind of got a big rise in it, they're going to have you shave those down, or put a piece of cement that's new there to prevent a trip hazard. So those are all important things to look at, and you're updating your rehab budget at this point because at some point the lender, especially if they're financing it, are going to want to see your rehab budget. I like to give them a more generalized budget in the beginning, meaning on the exterior. It might be exterior refresh, which is paint and siding. It might be landscaping. It might be big items. Instead of breaking it down and saying, like on the landscaping side, tree trim and flowers and this and that, because whatever you tell the lender, they're going to hold you to it. So start with a broader description of your rehab items, and then if they ask for more detail, then give it. But that way you're able to move monies, rehab dollars, into different categories just because you describe them in a much more broader fashion. And then the other item is survey review. So once you're under contract, one of the items that you will ask for is to see the survey on the property. The survey is a key part of the title commitment that the title company will issue for that property. So you want to understand, and you can even ask this in the beginning, how old is the survey? Some lenders want the survey redone or updated based on the age of the survey. And you have to allow time for that survey to be completed. It's taking 2 to 3 weeks in certain markets today to get the survey done. So you want to make sure that you submit that request to a survey company early enough that that's not the thing that's holding you up from closing, because you still have to allow time for the title company to review that survey before they finalize their title commitment. In addition, On the third party inspections, you want to do the same thing. You want to allow time for those. So in today's market, you can pay for an expedited property condition assessment and environmental assessment, but it's going to cost you a little more. So you want to set that expectation on the front end and try to engage those third party.
Uh-oh. I think Arleen froze. Can you guys hear me? Okay.
Yep.
All
Yeah,
right.
we can.
I think she's troubleshooting. I know I've had some moments where Zoom just dropped me and then
You
popped me
have
right back
a,
on. Here we go.
oh, oh,
Hey, you
okay.
dropped off for a moment. I'm glad we have you back.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. Let me,
Yeah,
where did I drop off? Did
it
you
was right
guys?
at the end of the last slide. So when you,
Okay.
yeah,
Okay. Did y'all hear the piece about surveys?
yeah, you were saying that sometimes they need to be updated. There could be a cost associated. And then after that, it kind of cut out a little
Okay.
bit.
Yes. I was saying that if they have to be updated because they are, call it more than 5 years old, then you want to allow for that in your budget and you want to allow time for that survey to get done. It might take 2 to 3 weeks to get done, and the title company needs to see that before your final title commitment is issued. And in some cases, the lender may want to review it also. So make sure that you include time and cost, the cost of a survey in your timeline for closing. Okay, great. So let me go to lender third-party inspections. So typically these are items that the lender will ask for you to pay up front, 10 to sometimes $30,000 for these. But the lender engages them. There have been a couple of occasions where we did what was called an early engagement, where we paid for these up front even before we had a term sheet from the lender. It's a little risky, but we were under the gun to close a year-end closing, so we went ahead and did that. It wasn't much, 10 to 15,000, so we were okay doing it. But the property condition assessment is one of the key ones. An engineering company would do it. They will take another look at your roofs, another look at your foundations. They don't do detail though. I mean, the report is very detailed, but don't count on that. You need to use this along with your own vendor inspections to really feel good about what's at that property. But from the property condition assessment, the lender will determine any immediate repairs that they're going to want you to do within, call it, the first 90 days of ownership. So it's important to pay attention and read and request that report from the lender so you can understand what are they going to ask you to pay for upfront at the closing table. They will also calculate a replacement reserve from this report. There's a big long table that shows appliances and air conditioning and heaters and boilers and lots of things at the property, which is taken from the inspector, and they determine what is the useful life of what's already there and at what point in the ownership of this or during the loan part of this will it have to be replaced. And they then will allocate an amount, 250 to call it 350 per unit, that they will take out with their mortgage payment every month. So you need to allocate that in your underwriting because it's an expense. Now it's neutral because once you spend it to make these repairs, you submit it to the lender along with copies of the checks and the invoices, and they send it back to you. So it's a wash, but you do need to account for it in your underwriting and understand if it's an older property, you're probably gonna be closer to 300 a unit. If it's a newer property, you're 2 to 250 a unit. So just a broad